Welcome to our series on global challenges, pandemic, and the world order. This week, our topic is the environment and energy, and we are fortunate to have two experts from our Georgetown community. First, Dr. Joanna Lewis, who is the Provost Distinguished Associate Professor of Energy and Environment and the Director of the Science, Technology, and International Affairs Program at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service. She's also a faculty affiliate in the China Energy Group at the U.S. Department of Energy's Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. And she has worked on energy and climate issues in China for 2 decades and has been a consultant to multiple foundations, governmental, non-governmental, and international organizations on related projects. We're also joined by Dr. Theresa Sabonis-Helf. She's the inaugural chair of the Science and Technology and International Affairs concentration at the Masters of Science in Foreign Service program at the Walsh School. Prior to joining Georgetown, she was a professor of national security strategy at the National War College in Washington, D.C. She has lived and worked in 7 countries of the former Soviet Union, has assisted 2 nations with the development of their first national security strategies. She's co-edited 2 volumes on Central Asia's political and economic transition. Both of our experts come with a long history of expertise, scholarship, and engagement on energy and environmental issues. We look forward to a conversation with them. I am so delighted to be joined by Dr. Joanna Lewis, who is the Provost Distinguished Associate Professor of Energy and Environment and the Director of Science, Technology, and International Affairs at the Georgetown University Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service. Joanna, thank you for taking the time to be with us today.
Of course, my pleasure.
Let's start with the world before the pandemic. How would you characterize global climate and energy challenges and opportunities pre-COVID? What were those challenges that the international community was facing before the pandemic hit?
Well, I think it's really interesting. 2020 is becoming, of course, a notorious year given what we're all going through. But for climate change, it was supposed to be a really important year for several reasons. First, from a scientific perspective, we are entering what is being referred to as essentially the decisive decade in dealing with climate change. Scientists tell us that in order to be on track for net zero emissions by 2050, which is what we would need to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, we would need to roughly cut our emissions in half this decade globally. So this decade, the decisions we make this decade for climate change are going to be crucial to our ability to get on the sort of emissions pathway that we would need to avoid the most dangerous impacts of climate change. And of course, the other thing that's really important about 2020 is we are now 5 years into the Paris Agreement, and this was supposed to be a really crucial year in the international climate change process. Countries were going to be increasing the commitments that they made under the Paris Agreement for the first time. Every 5 years, countries are supposed to up their commitments to try to take on even more ambitious actions domestically than they had already agreed to. And countries were also going to pledge what we call mid-century goals for the first time. So even longer term goals, which are of course really important because climate change is really a long-term, timescale issue. So we need to think about policies, not just in the next 5 years or 10 years, but in the next 20, 30, 40 years that will get us on these pathways. So, this is all, of course, been somewhat derailed, as I'll talk about later. Another thing, though, that's I think really important about this time in history is that in the energy space, we're at the first point in history where renewable energy sources like wind and solar are in most countries cost competitive now with fossil fuels because of the innovation we've seen, because of the learning we've experienced. And in some cases, they're actually even cheaper. They're cheaper to deploy as electricity sources than the traditional sources of power we've been using for decades. And so, it was poised to be a very important and potentially very exciting time for climate change. But of course, COVID has thrown a wrench in all of these things.
So you've outlined very well sort of why this was a crucial year and a crucial launch to a crucial decade. Walk us through how COVID did impact environmental issues and more broadly, climate change specifically. And are there areas that have been more readily impacted by COVID, or they're more negatively impacted by the pandemic?
Yeah, it is definitely a bit of a mixed bag. So, there's both positive and negative things that have come out of this. One sort of silver lining to the current situation is that emissions are down. People have stopped commuting to work, people have stopped traveling as much. But even with that, global emissions are still as high as they've ever been, because emissions that we had already emitted, they stay in the atmosphere for a long time, for a century or more. And then the other thing is that these are likely very temporary decreases in greenhouse gas emissions. Countries are putting in place economic stimulus packages that on net are not as green as we would have hoped. And it's of course very important for countries to stimulate their economy, to bring everyone back from this, but there are ways to do this that are both positive and negative for the environment. Right now we see, the European Union doing the best job of this. The EU has put forth the world's greenest stimulus plan. It's a 750 billion euro economic recovery plan. With the goal, it includes a goal for the EU to become carbon neutral by 2050. And this is really sort of set the stage for what other countries are doing. It's really put forward a model for how you could do a greener stimulus. We see some countries following suit, like South Korea has actually introduced a Green New Deal that would make it the first East Asian country to commit to net zero emissions by 2050. In contrast, we see countries like China putting forth stimulus packages that are not so green and are really more focused on revitalizing traditional industries. Another, I think, big negative of course, the rightful focus on the pandemic is that this, of course, takes away from focus on other issues. We know a lot of big meetings have been canceled. And as I mentioned, this was a very important year for the international climate negotiations. Countries were preparing to meet at COP26 later this year in the UK, and that meeting was canceled or postponed, pushed back at least a full year. And so there's been, less of a focus on this now. The good thing about this is that actually allows the international community to wait and see the outcome of the United States election, which everyone is watching, of course, very carefully because it has direct implications for climate change. I think one other interesting impact of this is that people are starting to rethink the way they live and work. Telecommuting may be here to stay in many cases where it makes more sense. People are reevaluating unnecessary purchases, just sort of the way we consume in general. And I think, another side of this is people are realizing the importance of science in informing policy and really understanding the science and the experts, because these things are complicated, and ignoring the scientists on the current pandemic has certainly been at our peril.
Mm-hmm. So there are a number of potential positives, but significant downsides, obviously, to this the traction from the progress that had been made on climate change. So the international community has not, it's not a surprise, been unified or well coordinated in its response to COVID. Do you expect that the international community will be better or worse at coordinating efforts on global challenges like climate change in the wake of the pandemic? You mentioned COP26. Do you think that the international community will start to realize that these global challenges need global responses?
Yeah, I think this is a really important question. We, I think, have been surprised at the lack of global coordination surrounding the pandemic. And I think there's a variety of reasons for this, but I do think a really notable absence of US leadership has been an extremely important factor. The US traditionally plays such an important role in supporting and staffing the international organizations that we would normally turn to in an outbreak like this. And I do think that the response to COVID-19 does show how important leadership can be. It's not just a question of having the technologies, of understanding the science. It really requires leadership to implement a strong response. And so, you know, there's a lot of parallels to this, to the climate change problem. You know, we've really seen in climate change that leadership is also extremely important, and that the US void is notable. You know, global momentum on dealing with climate change has slowed since President Trump entered office. And this is because the United States is still the largest historic emitter of greenhouse gases. The United States is still the largest industrialized country, wealthy country emitter. And the world follows our lead on these sorts of issues. And you know, the Paris Agreement, I think, wouldn't have come to be without US leadership under President Obama. You know, it is an international climate agreement with almost universal participation. We are now the only major, you know, economy that has said that we're going to withdraw. And so I think leadership has been so important here, and there's, you know, a lot of parallels that can be drawn from the lessons learned of this real absence of leadership from, you know, the pandemic to responding to the climate challenge.
Mm-hmm. Do we see other countries coming to fill that void that the United States has created with its absence in the Paris Agreement?
Yes, well, you know, the European Union, of course, plays an extremely important role. And as I mentioned, they've, you know, not only put forward very aggressive new international goals that have enhanced their previous goals, but they have been engaging with other important emitters, you know, other emerging economies like China. You know, the United States-China relationship is an extremely important one when it comes to climate change. And given that the United States is no longer engaging with China on these issues because of the, you know, the real evolution in our relationship over the last 4 years, you know, I think we do see countries like the EU trying to fill this void. We even see China stepping up in a variety of ways, but it's really quite different than what we would have expected to see, you know. And given our respective contributions to global emissions, I believe that there is no global solution to climate change without the United States, without China. And, you know, as history has shown, it's very important, even here in the United States, to understand what China's doing to get US support for climate policy here. And US-China cooperation on climate change has been really pivotal to mobilizing international action. You know, over the past 4 years, the United States government has done almost nothing to address climate change. And, you know, the situation at the state level is quite different. We see a lot of US states moving ahead, you know, very constructively, making real progress with their efforts to address climate change, but we need to do so much more. And the hurricanes we're seeing affecting the Gulf, the fires across the West, these are all now directly attributable to a warming climate signal and are only going to get worse.
Mm-hmm. Let's come back to the issue of US-China. Obviously, the great power competition between these two countries has been exacerbated recently, and certainly during the COVID pandemic time, and through economic competition and a number of other issues. How does that impact each country's engagement? And then you spoke a little bit about their collaboration and that impact on the rest of the world. Can you unpack that a bit?
Yeah, you know, well, as I mean, I mentioned what's happening here in the United States, which is very little. You know, in China, it's much more of a mixed picture. You know, despite calls for a green recovery, we've seen China's post-outbreak stimulus focus primarily on building, you know, high carbon energy and infrastructure projects. It's really concerning that China still continues to build new coal plants at a breakneck pace. They have almost 250 gigawatts of coal power capacity under construction in China right now, which is more than the entire coal capacity of the United States or of India. So that's, you know, that's just what's being built in the construction pipeline. But on the other hand, like, we see these really positive signals coming out of China. In the last couple of weeks, we saw China's president, Xi Jinping, address the UN General Assembly a couple weeks ago and announced new climate targets, including a plan to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. And this is the first time we've ever heard something like this from China. It's really quite notable that the president of that country would get up before the world at the UN and make this commitment that, if realized, would be a real sea change in what China has been doing, and would really, it could play a really important role in mobilizing very aggressive action to not just phase out fossil fuels, but to really, promote the development of cleaner technologies and industries, which is something that China has been quite a leader in. I think that a reset of the US-China relationship on climate change specifically is just going to be really crucial. I recognize, of course, I've worked in China for a long time, and the United States-China relationship has fundamentally changed in the last few years. And so any engagement with China is going to look very different from it, how it looked even just 4 years ago. But that said, I think this is an extremely important relationship, and climate change is one area where we actually have a mutual interest in getting this right and looking for ways to cooperate.
Excellent. Which actors do you believe will be most pivotal in ensuring that climate change challenges are most effectively addressed post-pandemic? And I would also love, you mentioned briefly sort of what sub-state actors, whether those are cities or states or provinces, are doing. So we'd love to hear if those are pivotal actors, as well as what does that picture look like?
Yeah, well, I think, there's a variety of really sort of big things that we're watching that could be sort of make or break for, the global response to climate change. The number one thing, as I alluded to earlier, is really the outcome of the United States presidential election. Biden has the most ambitious climate plan of any presidential candidate in US history. And if he were elected, if climate change became a priority of his administration, it could really mobilize a US response and motivate global action. And this, I think, would be like the single most important thing right now globally, in terms of mobilizing a response to climate change. But of course, no one country can solve this global problem, right? And so I think there's a lot of really other important actors here. And as you alluded, not just governments, but the private sector, for example, is going to play an extremely important role here. We already know, of course, there are huge opportunities in the low carbon, the clean energy transition. And much of this is benefiting countries who saw this coming and really invested strategically in this, like China. But much of the advanced innovation is still here in the United States, and we need to be much more strategic about investing in our own industries, about investing in innovation and R&D, and we also need to then create the markets that would support these technologies being deployed, which we do through a climate policy, a carbon price, something along these lines. And I think that one of the biggest factors that is sort of changing the way that states think about climate policy is the fact that the low carbon technologies, particularly in the energy space, that used to be very expensive, are not anymore. We now have experience using these technologies around the world. We know that research has shown, as I mentioned, that they are, if not at parity with other technologies, they are even less expensive and of course have many other benefits, not just for climate change, but for air pollution, and even for local jobs, local economic development. So I think this has been a real shift, just the really dramatic cost reductions we've seen in solar technology, for example, just over the last decade has been just very rapid. And this is something that I think really changes the way, changes the calculus for what it would cost countries to transition to a low carbon future. I think it's no longer about a trade-off between, dealing with climate change and other environmental problems and what the economic impact of that would be, right? We think of this as a cost to our economy, but actually I think people are realizing this could be a huge benefit to our economy. and actually even a benefit to our global competitiveness in the world, to bringing back local industries. And this is, again, something that I think other countries are capitalizing on already, and the United States is really falling behind on. You know, within the United States, there's a huge range of actors involved in this, and we've seen in the absence of federal leadership, a lot of subnational leaders really step up, governors, mayors, and, you know, of course, California always has played a leadership role historically in this area, and we've seen them move forward with extremely aggressive climate targets, renewable energy targets, standards to deploy low carbon technology, electric vehicles, things like this. And you know, this is great. Of course, you know, California in itself is one of the largest economies in the world, but you know, it is a US state and has limited ability to engage diplomatically with other countries. And of course, you know, US industries don't necessarily want to have different regulations in each state where they do business. It would be much better if we had a coherent federal policy that could capitalize on the lessons learned in California and other states, and, you know, help to mobilize the action we're already seeing at the subnational level and push it forward in a much more robust way at the federal level.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Last question, looking sort of on the bright side of this, what opportunities do you think have emerged due to the pandemic that may not have emerged had the global system not experienced this, this shock to the system?
Yeah, I think this is something we're all still thinking through, right? I mean, what are the long-term ramifications of this situation going to be, and what will we take from this on the other side? You know, one thing I see is we are learning new ways of communicating and engaging. And, you know, while I do a lot of international work, and I do believe that face-to-face interaction is still extremely important for international diplomacy. I do think, though, we are now learning that there's new ways to communicate, and this really opens up huge opportunities for bringing in a more diverse set of actors, and, you know, allowing us to engage with people and countries that, like, otherwise might be challenging to travel to or challenging to access. And so I think it's important to think about creative ways that this could affect the international, you know, diplomatic process. I mean, as you know, just as our courses here at Georgetown have moved online, we see, you know, huge multilateral meetings and conferences being moved online. We see, you know, meetings between heads of state moved online. And, you know, there's, as I think there's sort of both pros and cons to this, right? But if nothing else, the barriers to this now are much lower, right? And this really allows us to think about new ways to communicate and to learn globally, because we have these amazing technologies now that allow us to do this, and they're available in most of the world now. And so I think this could really allow us to think about broadening participation in a lot of, you know, important issues, from climate change to the global health response, and thinking about, you know, more creative and novel ways to do this with technology.
Mm-hmm. So I am hoping this era of Zoom culture does have a benefit for the world on climate change, and to recapture some of that good momentum that had been building. Joanna, thank you for your time and the work that you're doing on this issue. It's tremendously important, both to our community, but obviously to the world, as we look at how we deal with many of these global challenges. So thank you for taking the time today and sharing your expertise. And I look forward to seeing you in person, hopefully soon.
Thank you.
Take care. Welcome to our conversation on energy and the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Theresa Sabonis-Helf, who is the inaugural chair in the MSFS program for Science, Technology, in International Affairs. And she comes with a long and distinguished background, both working in practitioner circles in government as well as in academia, shaping the thinking and the actions in these issues. Theresa, welcome. Let me start with the first question of what were the global energy challenges that the international community was facing prior to COVID, so we can get a sense of a baseline of how COVID has impacted this sector.
Okay, well, the real dramatic issue that was already unfolding before COVID had to do with oil. And essentially, OPEC, which always had seen its own role as stabilizing price, the price kept going down and down. And in an effort to try to better manage the market, they actually created a new organization called OPEC Plus. And OPEC Plus is a 24-member group. It includes Russia, it includes all the former Soviet, it includes a whole bunch of governments that produce oil as government-owned enterprises. And this group of 24 was trying to moderate price, and they were having a really hard time. They convened for the first time in 2016, and every time they got together and cut, between 2016 and 2019, they cut 5 million barrels a day. But during that same time, the US kept increasing its own production. So no matter what they did, the US would ramp up production and kept flooding the market. And by March of this year, before COVID had really set in globally, they were convening again in a session to try to figure out what to do. The price of oil was at $52 a barrel, and they were mad. The two biggest players in OPEC Plus are Saudi and Russia, and they could not agree on how to make the price of oil stop falling or make the US stop eating into their market share. So that meeting broke down. And they marched out of it, and Saudi Arabia deliberately flooded the market with oil to try to force Russia back to the table. Right about then, the lockdown came in and things spiraled out of control. And so they started convening to try to deal with the problem of oil being at $52 a barrel. At the worst part of the price crisis for them, it dropped down to $16 a barrel.
Wow. Wow. So clearly something which there was a massive movement afoot prior to COVID. How did the lockdown and the halting of all international engagement, in the sense, how did that impact these dynamics which you're speaking of? And were there areas that were more profoundly hit, and others that were not so not touched by COVID?
So in oil specifically, the market had counted on world demand going up 1 million barrels of oil a day per year, which is a huge increase. But for decades, that's been the pattern. At least 1 million barrels of oil a day of new demand every year. During COVID, the world demand for oil dropped the lowest that it's been since 1995. Because with the lockdown, everyone stayed home and manufacturing largely ceased. And oil is mostly in transportation and in manufacturing. So it really completely fell apart. And at this point, the guess is that even though oil demand is rebounding in some places in the world, that instead of oil going up 1 million barrels a day for this year, it's probably going to go down 9 million barrels a day compared to last year. And this reinforces something really important that's been happening in oil. The stock of oil producing companies has performed very, very poorly over the past 13 years compared to all other baskets of stocks. The price of oil has been so volatile, it's been going up and down. And one of the things that shows how the global market is thinking about this, I don't know if you read about this, but in August, the Dow Jones removed ExxonMobil. It used to be ExxonMobil was one of the oldest members of the Dow Jones. Now it's gone, and there is only one oil company left in the basket of companies that the Dow Jones uses to think about what's going on in world markets.
What do you think the impact of the removal of Exxon is, or this shift away from these large oil companies, and how at least the Dow Jones is looking at it?
Well, many companies have actually done better after they were removed from the Dow Jones. But in terms of the long-term trend in oil, companies, individuals are beginning to get worried about stranded assets. The world is moving away from oil, not away from gas yet, but oil and coal, there is a clear shift away. And since in oil, you're making investments for the 20 and 30-year future, the question is, will these things pay back or not. And the more the market believes they might not, the less there's money available for ambitious new investments in oil. There still seems to be a lot of appetite for investment in gas, but oil, we're seeing demand destruction that may not recover after COVID. And that in turn leads to less investment.
Can you speak to some of the other parts of the energy sector, whether it is gas or other parts of, and what did that look like prior to COVID, and how has that been impacted? And not just how has it been impacted by COVID, but how has it been impacted by how oil has been impacted by COVID?
It's a great question. So one thing that most people don't know is that as late as 2019, if you look at the global energy mix, so if you look at what forms of energy we use for transportation, heat, light, electricity, for everything, for manufacture, oil was still the largest single component. It is likely that going forward, it won't be. The components that have been rising, and renewable energy has been rising the most rapidly, but from a very low base. So renewables is sort of rocketing up and trying to get to 10% of the energy mix, but it's not there yet. Natural gas is rising dramatically and is taking the place of coal, and I think will begin in some ways to take the place of oil. So natural gas is on the rise pretty significantly, both in terms of investment and in terms of the share of global energy. The big exciting news during COVID has been renewable energy. For the first time in many markets, including the United States, renewable electricity was the biggest share of electricity. And that's because in domestic law in a lot of countries, we prefer to use renewables when we can. And when overall demand is down, then renewable electricity takes up a bigger share. This has been exciting because it's demonstrating that renewable electricity can take up a bigger share of the grid and can successfully do that. So we've seen a lot of growth in that. And green energy is a huge piece of the European Union's recovery package. So they are doing a lot of investment in renewable energy and in efficiency. One of the things about electricity is that demand is really different at various points of the day, and trying to deliver electricity in real time is hard because demand fluctuates 150% every 24 hours. During COVID, during the lockdown, when manufacturing was halted and everyone stayed at home, we actually flattened the demand curve. We saw how much easier it is to produce electricity when you don't have dramatic ups and downs. So there's new interest in how do you manage demand so that you don't have 150% variation every 24 hours. And once you begin to engage that sector, there's a lot more room for renewables.
Fascinating. So how is a shift then from oil towards natural gas and renewables? How does that shift the geopolitical landscape? If we have some countries which are unquestionably more reliant on oil for a significant portion of their state revenue or for their private sector growth, what does that look like, and which countries are suffering more because of this shift, and which countries are coming onto the global landscape in a way which maybe was not expected?
So Saudi Arabia is clearly suffering. They have taken some oil revenue and they're plowing it into actually concentrated solar power. They're trying to capture a technological lead on a solar technology, but there's no question that their revenue base is beginning to erode. But Saudi's got an advantage, and that is their oil is cheaper to get out of the ground than anybody else's. So Saudi will be in the oil market longer than everybody else. The nations that suffer the most are the ones that are highly reliant on oil, and it's a little bit more expensive to get out of the ground. So for example, Russia, Venezuela, some of the new oil in Africa, any country where the cost to get it out of the ground is high gets hit very hard by this. And any country where the government has been counting on oil revenues to make the budget gets hit very hard. So in the latter issue, the government relying on the budget, that's everybody in OPEC, that's Russia. And then in terms of high cost producers, that's particularly non-Arab OPEC, and again, Russia. The winners, well, interestingly, Russia continues to be the two countries that have the largest proven reserves of natural gas are Russia and Iran. So when we look at the European eagerness to settle with Iran, that's connected to Europe knowing that Russia and Iran are the two the least cost options. The biggest producer in LNG, and LNG, because it's natural gas that we move in the sea lanes, is more flexible. You can change partners. When it's pipelines, you can't. So the most important player in LNG is Qatar. Although the United States is producing more gas than Qatar, Qatar still has a huge advantage in LNG markets. They export more than the US does, and they are the key player in LNG. They're rapidly expanding, but of course there's a lot of political risk in Qatar right now because of the blockade. So even as we move more toward world markets, when the US has long been an advocate of gas behaving more like oil. So that means your suppliers are more flexible. A single supplier can't do as much damage to you as they can in pipeline gas. Well, yes, so we're reducing political risk, but the more and more we move gas into the sea lanes, the more volatile the price becomes. So we lower political risk and we're raising economic risk. And one of the big downsides of the world getting a much more open market for natural gas is we're going to see a lot more volatility in price. And because we rely on gas in our electricity grids, the whole reason we pushed oil out of our electricity grids in an era before we were worried about climate is because the price being so volatile makes it extremely hard to manage an electricity sector with an input that's volatile. Well, gas is going to rise in volatility. It's still, we have overland gas in America, and overland is a lot cheaper than once you put it in the sea lanes and as LNG. So we're still going to have a price advantage, but the more the world market is attractive, the more the US market is going to get integrated into the world market. So we're actually going to lose the current advantage we have of being proximate to the gas, and therefore it's really cheap.
Mm-hmm. Number of questions coming to mind. Let me first start with, you were talking about the countries that are going to be challenged because their economy relies heavily on oil. So the Venezuelas, possibly Nigeria, and other countries in Africa, you said. Are those countries, do we expect those countries will be able to shift away from oil, or do you think that this will be a crisis for many of those countries? Obviously, Venezuela is facing its own crisis in a number of ways, but will it be a crisis, or will there be an easier pivot that some of these countries will be able to make in order to offset that challenge?
It's a slow burn crisis. We're not going to wake up one day and the world isn't using oil anymore. I would argue that we're past peak demand, and that just means we're past the moment where we want more every year. So demand will be stable and then it will decline. Countries are going to begin trading more and more with China, because China's demand for oil hasn't peaked yet. So the market already has shifted toward China because China is the world's largest importer. China is also likely to be the only place where demand continues to grow. But what you're going to see is that as the price of oil goes down, poor countries are going to want to continue using it, and it's going to be harder to move away. So the good news is when the price goes down, investors are less keen. The bad news is when the price goes down, the developing world, which is still trying to get the lights on, is going to want more. So what we're going to see is that oil flows more and more to the developing world and less to the developed world. But I don't think that oil is going to stop being wanted by the developing world for a while, because frankly, the single largest piece of Asia's energy puzzle right now remains coal. And so they will move, coal will be the first one to sort of start to go away. Oil will take up some of coal's space. And so this is a slow process. And although we see a lot of innovation, innovation is expensive. So when the price drops, poor countries will continue to use it. We've seen that phenomenon with coal. We will see that phenomenon with oil. And since we still have 1.2 billion people who don't have regular access to electricity, and most of those people also don't have full access to transportation, we're not done with the world wanting oil. It's just dramatically shifting who wants it and how much they can pay.
Excellent. Let me talk about the Middle East and then let's come back to China because I want to talk about that global, that great competition piece as well. So you talked about Saudi Arabia obviously has an easier lighter burden to bear as things shift away from oil, but nonetheless, their economy is significantly reliant on its oil industry, and Iran is utilizing its natural resources and natural gas. How is that shifting what has been a very tense relationship, obviously, between Iran and Saudi Arabia and their respective influence on countries in their region with the shift in energy?
So we're used to the idea that when the price of oil goes up, oil-rich countries become more repressive. And that's because, you know, there are more contenders for the throne and you kind of have to demonstrate that you're firmly in power. The problem is when the price of energy is low, democracy does not break out. What happens is that these countries begin to have considerable domestic problems because they subsidize their own people so heavily. The strategy for many years among the wealthier, more stable Middle Eastern countries is to build these sovereign wealth funds, which are essentially trust funds for their countries, and they can draw on those trust funds to supplement the budget in years when oil revenue is low. So the countries with the large sovereign wealth funds are doing better than the countries that don't have them. Countries like Iran don't have them. Now, Iran in the medium term can sell gas to lots of people, so they're going to be okay. But in the short term, the revenue goes down. They have a large population. The population is unhappy. So ironically, we know that when the price of oil goes up, there's more repression. When the price of oil gets low and the domestic populations get very restive, we see countries at a crisis point, and that can either end in repression, that can end in reform, that can end in collapse of governments, but there is increased domestic instability because these countries have built in a dependence. They have built their budgets around assumptions about what they're going to get in oil revenue, and they're not going to get it. Mm-hmm. So the transition away, again, it varies by country. Countries that have arable land, countries and can turn to other things are in better shape than countries that don't have other options. One of the reasons we see not only Saudi Arabia, but lots of Middle Eastern countries getting into the solar business is that's a comparative advantage. What are their comparative advantages? And the other terrifying thing for the arid Middle East countries is we know from the data we have available that if you're going to have to manufacture water, so if you're going to have to use desalination to provide your people with fresh water, based on Israel's experience, that doubles the electricity demand per capita of a country. Mm. So at the same time, when the revenues are going down, these countries are looking at a climate-imposed shift where they're going to have to produce more water, which is energy intensive. So there's a very scary energy do loop there. But there's also a huge amount of room for energy efficiency because the Middle Eastern countries have never been made efforts to become more energy efficient.
Excellent. Let's move to great power competition. You mentioned Russia's role, obviously pre-COVID as they were working within this group and how they've been impacted as oil has hit hard times. And you've talked about China's significant consumption of oil, and the United States also looking for its role both in oil as well as in natural gas. How do you see the energy sector impacting the competition that we see between these three countries on a global scale?
So I want to introduce a fourth, and that's the EU. And the reason I want to introduce the EU is because they made next generation energy a priority in their recovery package. It's got a huge chunk of their recovery package. And Europe is very ambitiously going after carbon neutrality by 2050, which many people and even some members of the EU, such as Poland, say is impossible. But they've decided that green energy is the future. Think for a minute about why. The European Union is very poor in other natural resources. So in addition to their climate concerns, if they capture a technological lead in renewables, it gives Europe the first opportunity they've had since industrialization to be truly self-sufficient and a global power in what happens next in energy. So Europe is chasing that. China, on the other hand, if we look at urban air quality in July 2020, it was worse than urban air quality in July 2019, because China made a decision that recovery from COVID was so important that they had to relax the environmental restrictions, allow industry to ramp up and move forward. In the United States, we've seen shades of both of those arguments. It's a very political question, but your assumption about how you recover from COVID will shape whether you give up on environmental restrictions and burn as fast and furious as you can, or whether you take the fact that we had this demonstration effect from COVID, challenge all your assumptions and move forward differently. It isn't clear which of those paths the US will choose. We actually have the endowments to go either way. So it depends on leadership and political choices. With Russia, Russia is going to continue to do energy intensive manufacturing in things like aluminum. So they will consume their own energy as best they can to move forward. But they're also going to be making very strong arguments that the European economies cannot rebound in this environment of intensive sanctions. Because remember, Russia's got a lot of grievance going on right now between the sanctions were already making them suffer. And if you go all the way back to March when that battle between Saudi Arabia and Russia broke the oil market in pieces, Saudi Arabia has always known that if the global economy is depressed, they suffer because they're an energy supplier. Russia's got a grievance with the global economy. So what Russia will do in energy and with energy remains pretty unclear. And then, of course, there's the other issue, which is in America, we don't have a national policy about energy production. It's lots of industry pursuing their own interests that causes us to collapse the price of oil. But during the height of COVID, President Trump apparently gave assurances to OPEC Plus that no money in government relief would be available for the oil industry to keep expanding. So the promise that the US industry is on the ropes is part of what Russia and Saudi Arabia need to move forward. So there's a really crazy competition going on here. And the big irony here is that China is no question a consumer of energy, and their politics are going to be shaped by they're a consumer and they need more. Russia's a producer, and their competition is going to be shaped by the fact they need to sell more. The United States can't figure out if we're more a producer or more a consumer, because our history is as more a consumer than a producer, but our current capacity is to be a producer, but we're not behaving in world markets like a net producer, we're behaving like a consumer.
Fascinating. Do you expect any significant moves from any of those three actors in order to shore up the position that they are in, that they've been put in because of COVID and how it has exacerbated the existing problems?
So China already did one thing that was really important, and that is they've been talking for a long time about the need to build up their own strategic reserves. They didn't have a large amount of them, and they don't belong to the big treaty organization that helps manage oil supply in a crisis. China took advantage of the oversupply of oil to build up its strategic reserves. So China is less vulnerable in oil than they have been in a long time, because although they're still importing huge volumes through the Straits, they now actually have a strategic reserve. So best practices is to have a strategic reserve that replaces 2 months worth of imports. We don't know because they don't have to share the numbers because they don't belong to a treaty organization, but they probably are following best practices. Russia, this is speculation on my part and I can't prove it, but ongoing unrest in the Middle East fundamentally serves Russia's interests as an energy exporter. And there is a lot of suspicion that their adventurism in Syria is partly about that. They are supposed to be one of the chief negotiators, and yet they have no interest in a stable resolution. We're also seeing an awful lot of trouble in Nagorno-Karabakh in the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. That's a scary moment because Iran is an energy supplier to Armenia. Turkey has taken the position that they are going to support Azerbaijan. Russia's positioning itself as a mediator. That's a conflict Russia does not want, but it may spin beyond their control. If it does, then we have a whole new set of crises that will affect energy.
Fascinating. We've spoken primarily about national governments, about national state governments, but there are a lot of other actors in this field. Obviously, there's private sectors, there are local actors, there are international organizations and ad hoc coalitions of countries. Which other actors do you see significantly shaping these next months and years of the energy sector?
So if you look at the big data over time, having energy resources is not associated with the likelihood of conflict, but it's very highly associated with duration of conflict. If you can access oil, which, for example, ISIS did during their conflict, or the separatist group in Nigeria, or even the Chechens in Russia, if you can access energy resources, you can stay in the fight a lot longer. And so what we see is that a lot of the seemingly unresolvable, long, slow, unfolding crises in the world, all the players, particularly the non-state actors, have access to energy that they can sell and keep them in the business. Now, certainly it did not serve Turkey's interests for ISIS to endure as long as it did, but an awful lot of ISIS's oil was making it into the Turkish market. And individual actors were deciding that the savings in oil was worth buying from Daesh, and so they continued to do so. So one of the big issues in energy is that the non-state actors can keep going for a long time because they can access something of value that can keep them going. So those non-state actors are important. Even though the industry is important, all of the largest players in oil and gas are state-owned companies, not private companies. So that state market tension and contention is really important because states are much more engaged in that than they are in most other sectors. The United States is the only major exporter of oil or gas that has no state company that is important to the state and to some extent greater or lesser managed by the state. And so the behavior of all other energy players is different than the behavior of America. So that state market tension and contention will continue. We had actually evolved over the years some cooperation of how do we deal with OPEC as energy importing nations. And we had a pretty stable protocol for how to deal with OPEC until the United States became the disruptor and a major exporter and overwhelmed. So I think one of the big things we're going to see is that the United States, as a bunch of disaggregated actors, is going to keep fumbling around trying to figure out what its corporate and national interests are in an era in which the markets have changed, the interests have changed, and what the people want has changed. It's sort of extraordinary that the United States is rocketing ahead as an oil and gas power at a moment where most developed states are moving away from oil and having debates about how long-term the future of gas is. So in a sense, the United States has rocketed to the head of an industry that many other players think is a dying industry.
Fascinating. I want to come back to this point of sub-state or non-state actors, non-state malign actors and their accessing of oil. Have we seen any impact because of COVID on the ability of non-state actors to function, to access oil and to continue their terrorist activities or otherwise parastate activity? Or has COVID sort of left that untouched to some extent?
Well, I think that COVID has played both ends at once. Global demand is so low and the price is so low that grabbing the oil and selling it doesn't get you as much as it does when the price is higher. But it is easier to grab because nations are grappling with these crises. So there is more supply in the hands of non-state actors, presumably at this moment, but they can't sell it for as much. So it kind of ends up being a bit of a wash.
Mm-hmm.
However, if non-state actors learn how to get access and get good at getting access, it's hard to squeeze them back out. When we look at the data on Nigeria, it's sort of astonishing, but on any given day, more than a quarter of all the oil they produce is stolen. The state can't account for it. It is the non-state actors who take it. And the global market is so big and so liquid that it disappears without a trace into the global market. And think about when the state's capacity is further reduced, those entities get built into the system and find ways to take the resources, and it becomes really hard to move them back out. So we don't see the effect right now, but it's quite possible that the entrenchment is occurring.
Mm-hmm. So you have states that are less capable to deliver on their basic state responsibilities because they have less resources, fewer resources to draw from. And at the same time, you have these non-state actors that are in some ways serving as pseudo states in some places. I think Nigeria is certainly one of those places where we see portions where non-state actors have taken over a lot of services and governance to some extent because they have the resources to provide those services.
There's one other actor, and we always leave them out because we like them, and that is sub-state actors that are not necessarily non-state. So when we look at what's going on in the Kurdish region of Iraq, they are very competently managing their energy resources. But the longer the Iraqi central government is unable to stand up a credible government and deliver any gains to them, the stronger one corner of Iraq becomes. We've seen the same phenomenon in an earlier time in Russia when the central state is weak. It's not just non-state actors, it's the energy-rich provinces that begin to wonder what they need the central government for.
Interesting.
So
Interesting.
that challenge as well.
Interesting. We see so many different forces that are undermining central state power and their ability to govern and their ability to provide basic state services. This is a fascinating conversation. I could continue for much longer, but I know our time is limited. So let me ask you one last question, which is, what opportunities do you see that have come out of this COVID time that may not have emerged had we not been thrust into this pandemic? How do you see, looking forward into the future, how do you see the energy sector?
So the first one sounds a little bit funny, but it has to do with climate, and it has to do with the fact that we have known that the only tool we have to address climate change is to flatten the curve. And we had been unable for decades to build the case or communicate to publics what it means to flatten a curve, why you would flatten a curve, what are the potential gains. One of the few upsides of COVID is that the idea of flattening the curve and the idea that of what difference it makes if you take measures to reduce a bad, even if you know that it isn't suddenly magically going to become good, that narrative is now built into international discourse. And so I think that's helpful. Although, of course, in many countries like our own, where we fail to flatten the curve, we'll see if that's a useful narrative. But at least the idea of behavior change that takes something that's coming at you and reduces the intensity with which it will hit you, that's a narrative that we need to understand for climate change. So that's one. The second is the demonstration effect of getting renewables in the grid. We've seen that it's possible to run the US grid with a larger contribution from renewables than from coal. And that will be the story of 2020. It's possible. So we've got that ability to keep going with that if we choose to. And that's exciting because the narrative in the United States has been that you couldn't allow renewables to be too much of the grid. That would create all kinds of other follow-on problems. Another opportunity that again is going to sound not intuitive, but I've been fascinated by it because it's unfolding in Europe in this really cool way, is the change in work styles. In nations of Europe where people have gone back to work, more than 20 to 40%, depending on country, of workplaces have been compelled to move to more flexible work because people are accustomed to it and they prefer it. As we change the way that we work, that fundamentally changes our energy footprint. So even when we're not in lockdown, if we're lowering commute, if we're changing expectations for how people get work done, that changes how our productivity connects with energy. So it is possible that if we change the way we work, white collar work, work that can be done remotely, if this has a lasting impact on how we work, it will also have a lasting impact on the relationship between work and energy demand. And I think that's going to be fascinating.
Certainly something to watch. We never thought these would be the conversations we would have, but COVID has really shaken up so many so significantly. This has been fascinating, Theresa. I am so thrilled that you are leading part of our team and that you are bringing all of your STIA expertise to MSFS and SFS because there are so many issues that we're going to be dealing with in the near term, but certainly over the long term. Thank you for taking the time, and I look forward to our discussion with our students about these issues.
Excellent. Thanks very much. I'm glad to be a part of it.
Fascinating conversations with two of our leading experts from the Walsh School of Foreign Service. Let me put out two questions for us to think about as we move into discussions. First, how do we think about great power conflict and great power competition and how that will impact the energy markets? And to what extent will COVID either expedite those shifts that we're seeing in the energy markets, and to what extent will it derail some of those shifts? Secondly, climate change is an area where we have seen significant cooperation among countries across the world. And we also see in other situations like the pandemic that we're facing, a need for global collaboration and cooperation across the world. How will these two dynamics, the collaboration that we see from climate change and the collaboration which we see and at times don't see in responding to the pandemic, how will this impact us? And as we think about this idea of building back better, will we draw some lessons from either the climate change or the pandemic experiences to look for new models or different models that will allow us to continue with global collaboration for some of these problems which truthfully only have global solutions? I hope you enjoy the discussion.